We didn't think so, and I'll tell you why in a minute. All right, is the assumption that public opinion is important or a driver or a determinant of policy outcomes a legitimate one? Okay, so from an academic perspective, leaving the policy aside, is it reasonable to think that what the public thinks will manifest itself in policies that the government takes? Yes or no?
Yeah.
Yeah, why? Somebody said yes really strongly, yes?
Well,
Why?
because if a government's voted in, they're voted in by the people, and the people, basically they've got the authority of the people to make those decisions.
Okay, in a democracy, we think governments are elected of, by, for the people, to borrow some US constitutional language, yes? And that governments are elected to represent the will of the people. That's the basic kind of democratic representative form of government. In political science, we call this kind of democratic responsiveness theory, that democratic governments ought to or should be responsive to the will of the people. Theoretically, at least, this makes sense. Okay? This assumption that what the public thinks should manifest itself in policy change, and we agree with. We think that there's lots of evidence that this happens across other policy issues. But for this issue, we question it. And one reason we question it is because we know those opinion policy linkages are particularly weak when we're talking about foreign policy issues compared to domestic policy issues. And we also know that the public have less well-constructed attitudes and opinions on foreign policies compared to domestic policies, which they get exposed to on a much more frequent basis. So, at least theoretically, in principle, this is a good argument, but we don't know how well it works, okay, for the case of aid specifically. This is a simple kind of plot. Blue line is percent of ODA as, ODA is a percent of GNI. Green line is public support, and here's time. What we see from this data is there is some co-movement. So if we think about the theoretical question, does public opinion help drive aid levels? Then one way to kind of test that is to look at public support and aid levels and to see if those lines move or co-vary together. Now we can see some movement, okay? We can see these lines moving together here, we can see moving here, but they're going in opposite directions here. So if I were to look at that data and say, right, what does the evidence tell me? Right, empirically there looks to be some case to argue this, but I think we need to look a bit further. Now, let me explain this rather silly looking graph. This is a slope, okay? It's essentially a line of best fit for these data points. And what these data points are different countries, and it's the aggregate opinion support for aid in a bunch of different countries, so the high of 100%, low of 30%, and this is ODA as a percent of GNI. What we did with this particular graph is we just wanted to test the correlation. We just wanted to see if there was a relationship between public support and level of ODA. And we did this measure here. We took all three of these questions, okay? So we took the very, very hard question, but maybe the most policy-specific relevant question. We took the kind of, do you generally think it's a good idea in principle question, and we took the concern question. And we added them all together, and we looked at the correlation, and essentially, it's flat. So if we're looking at correlation statistics, if you get a correlation statistic of 0, it means there's no relationship. There's no link between opinion and aid levels. Our statistic here is 0.02. It's essentially 0. And a flat line like that means there's no relationship. Okay? A positive line would look something like this, a negative one would look something like that. That's not statistically significant either. Okay? We'll leave the statistics out of it. We did a second test and said, right, if we took out the kind of more generous question, the one that we think is really not a good question to ask people, and we just asked these two, we actually see a negative relationship between opinion and aid levels. So here, the correlation coefficient is negative 0.4, still essentially flat, but all of a sudden it goes in the opposite direction that we would expect it to. So on the surface of it, there isn't much empirical evidence. to support the idea that what is important to the public is actually manifesting itself in terms of the government's aid policy. Now, in recent years, there's been lots of survey data trying to understand what's happened to that 70% kind of headline with the economic downturn. And a study from IBS out of Sussex found that the picture isn't so pretty. 63% think aid should be cut. 64% think that poverty at home should be a priority. Okay, so what somebody echoed here, should take care of business at home before we go elsewhere. But more than 6 in 10 said giving aid is morally a right thing to do. But over half of respondents thought that aid is wasted. So here's a slightly murkier picture of how we understand aid. People think it should be reduced. We should focus on domestic priorities. But I think it's good that we do it, but a lot of it's wasted. That's a very complex set of opinions. How do we understand those? All right. One argument that we've tried to do in our research, the argument that we gave to the International Development Committee when they asked for evidence on the future of aid policy in the UK, is simply that the problem, we think, lies in the questions. You're asking the wrong questions, you're getting essentially not very good responses as a result, and so you shouldn't have a lot of confidence in this top-line figure. This top-line figure, we've argued, is actually really quite misleading. And when we saw some of the fall in support as a result of the economic crises, we said, look, this is entirely to be expected. If you ask people questions like, do you care about poverty, they're going to say yes. If you ask them questions like, should we spend more on aid in the time of an economic crisis, they're going to say, probably not. Okay? There's different ways to get at these questions. So, we kind of make the case that support for aid, despite this top-line figure, has always been shaky. It's an interesting statistic to cite, but it doesn't tell the real picture. And for policymakers now, this has got them in a bit of trouble. Right, I've got 5 more minutes and then I will free you up from this lecture. Let me tell you 4 reasons why we think these survey questions are bad and how we might improve them. This is some of the data we looked at. All right, first argument is this. There's a notion in social sciences of validity, okay? And to illustrate this, let me ask you to play a game with me. When I say crime, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? Crime. Jail. Crime. Huh? Rate. Crime. Police. Law. Prison. Robbery. Conviction. Punishment. Shooting. Say again? Deviance. She just saw a Now in a real lecture, I'd ask your name and say, come over here, right? Crime. Orlando.
Hanging.
Hanging. Wow, that's a good one. Crime. Law. Anybody, if I say crime, what's the type of crime that pops into your head? Murder. Looting. Say again. Violent crime. Youth crime, theft. Okay, here's the concept I'm trying to get at. This notion of validity is essentially how well can we as social scientists measure concepts that we're interested in. And one thing that social scientists are interested in is crime, yes? Another thing we're interested in is poverty. So how well do the questions we ask people reflect the concept that we're really interested in? Now, one problem with crime, as an example to illustrate, is if I asked you about specific types of crime, all of you said rape, robbery, battery, theft, murder, shooting. You said what? Really obvious, highly reportable, and highly measurable types of crime. What didn't come out of your mouth was things like domestic abuse, child abuse, money laundering, white-collar crime. Things that are not very well recorded, they are better these days, but they're not very well reported, okay? So if we think of crime as being rape, robbery, murder, and theft, but not things that are underreported or more difficult to measure, then we don't actually get a good estimate of what crime is in a society, do we? Okay? Now that same logic works for trying to understand support for poverty. If you just ask people, do you care about poverty? A bunch of people say yes, and then you take that headline and you say, wow, that means we can go spend billions on aid. It doesn't make real sense in the picture when the people actually say, no, I think we should spend our money here, okay? Those aren't measuring equivalent concepts. And so how we ask these questions needs some revision. So there are different ways that we can ask about these. And I talked about social desirability response bias. Now, one way we can try and do this better. How many of you have answered a survey, a legitimate survey, not one from like Next or on the street if you want to donate to a cat shelter or something like that? Those aren't legitimate. What you often get is a question that says something like, of the top 4 issues that you see below, which one's the most important for you? Okay, and it may be something like education, crime, rubbish pickup, or pensions or something like that. Now, lots of people will choose amongst those, but it may not be the issue that's really genuinely the most important for you, but it's a constrained set of examples because that's what the survey pollster has put on there. What we know is that when you ask people, do you care about poverty, they say yes. But we ask people if we said, right, if you had £10 that you wanted the UK government to allocate to spend on improving different policy areas, how much would you allocate towards education? How much would you allocate towards global poverty? How much would you allocate towards refuse collection? How much would you allocate towards, equality? And when we do that, when we ask a much more specific question about people's relative priorities, we see that poverty is actually quite low down the list, okay? Global poverty compared to more domestic policy issues. So be wary of questions or surveys that say, do you really care about this? Well, yes, I really care about campaign finance, I care about crime, I care about equal pay, I care about lots of things. But how much do I care about it relative to other issues? Okay, that's another important issue. So asking good questions is one way. Second, almost there, knowledge and awareness. Now, you guys did really well in terms of estimating how much the UK and other countries spend on foreign aid. The rest of the world isn't as clever. Right? I told you about Americans, they're not particularly bright, and as one I can say that. Europeans are slightly more clever. They think about 14% of national budgets go to aid. Right? In reality, we know that people don't know very much, but yet they hold very, very strong opinions about what we ought to do with aid. We think you've got to understand attitudes towards aid in light of how much people know about aid, okay, to get a really kind of robust sense of that. Perceptions of aid effectiveness, 3. One thing that we know colors attitudes about support for aid, and specifically increasing aid expenditure, is what people think about aid itself. How effective is it? Is most of it wasted? How do they think about corruption in these issues? And you raised the question about kind of governance issues or concerns about particular regimes. This is something that we need to estimate a bit better. All right, and much more at the individual level. What motivates people's attitudes towards aid? Is it, as Rowan said, well, I think people have strong moral obligations for why we support aid or why we think this is a worthwhile activity. Is it self-interest? Is it national interest? Is it religiosity? Is it some concern about being a global citizen? Is it being charitable? Is it about justice issues? Is it because you've traveled to a foreign country and you just have a greater deal of exposure beyond the UK border? We need to know a lot more, okay, about how those work. Right, last slide. This particular policy, and this may sound familiar to you, has been heavily talked about as having a strong evidence base. Okay? That what we do in terms of UK development policy is supported by a strong evidence base. We've spent a lot of time saying that evidence base is particularly poor. Okay? And we want to understand it better, and we have lots of stuff we're doing now to try and understand that better. But as support for a particular policy, we think policymakers have got it wrong. one question to think about. Public opinion has been characterized as a mile wide and an inch deep. Okay? And what that's to say is this line here. We can go out and ask people, and lots of people say they're concerned about poverty in developing countries. Loads of people support this. But the depth of that support isn't very robust. Okay? When you start asking other questions, what we find is support chips away till it's actually reasonably low. Is it better, as a policymaker, to have support that's a mile wide, to have widespread support even though it's shallow or weak? Or is it better, as a policymaker, to have support that's an inch wide, okay, but essentially a mile deep? So there's a much smaller cohort of the public out there who really support development aid, who know lots about it, who will motivate their colleagues, their friends, who will write to their MPs, who will protest and sign petitions about it. And that has knock-on effects on a policy. Is that what you desire? Or is it better to have widespread support, but one that's not very well kind of invested in the policy? Right? Those are interesting questions to talk about, I think, as political scientists. But I will give you Orlando here, who will talk to you about much more relevant things, I think. Yeah? Right. Do you have any questions? You never do at the end of a lecture. You're already ready for university, because that's it. You get done with the lecture, everybody's like, right, we're packing up on the way out. Would you like me to introduce Orlando in here? Right, Orlando in here, why don't I sit Right. For the next half hour, you are going to get the benefit of wisdom for Orlando Ward. Orlando is a PhD student here at UCL. She is one of my PhD students, which is how I get to rope her into these things. And she is looking essentially at how differences in race and gender are portrayed in US and UK election campaigns. Nihir Dasandi is now Dr. Nihir Dasandi, having just finished his PhD. His work looks at poverty and inequality, and he's going to be spending next year with UCL as a postdoctoral fellow. Thank you very much for your time for doing this, because I appreciate it, and I will leave them with your hands. And I will see you later.
Okay, so we're going to start. We're going to basically make a few points that we think we could have done better when we did our undergraduate degrees, things that occurred to us or to friends. And then we're going to leave plenty of time for you guys to ask questions about what you think you might expect, or questions you have about doing a degree. So to begin with, so we're kind of, the points are arranged into kind of three categories. So we'll start by just making some general points about the kind of academic context of doing a degree. We'll then talk about some of the social aspects of being at university, and then we'll talk a bit about career development. So to begin with, so I'm going to make a couple of points. So the first thing is, so my undergrad degree was actually in maths with economics, and that was a huge mistake, which I discovered very late. So most of you have already kind of gone past that point in selecting, I think, a far more interesting and a really useful degree, which Jennifer or Dr. Hudson has just shown you. But within doing a politics degree, you're going to be faced with a lot of choices for what types of modules, what types of courses you can do. So this probably won't be in the first term of your first year, where you'll have some basic introductory politics classes. But by the second term of your first year, so one of the really important things that we think in making that kind of course selection is really think about what interests you. So what are the topics? So there's a whole range of subjects within politics. So as Dr. Hudson just pointed out, so development would be a big category. Security and terrorism is a big subject, and conflict. Domestic politics, so British politics and MPs' behaviour, how public opinion affects these things. So you've got a whole range of topics. So really, instead of, there's a tendency even at the master's level, we get students that want to second guess, so which is the easiest course, which lecturers are the nicest or going to get the highest marks. Really important, because you generally get it wrong, so it's much better to focus on what topics really interest you. The second point I'm going to make in terms of academic, Dr. Hudson's talk really kind of highlights it. So there's a tendency, so you'll find you have far more free time. It's far more flexible doing a degree than it is doing school classes. So attendance at lectures might not be compulsory, and there's an obvious tendency not to go to all of the lectures, but Dr. Hudson's lecture really highlights why it's a big mistake that I think both of us at some point have made, which is that you're going to have to read for about a month to get the information you've just got in the space of 45 minutes an hour. So the other really kind of useful bit of information is it actually saves you more time, it frees up more time in the long run if you do attend classes.
I've just got a couple more academic points to make before we move on to the probably more interesting social stuff. But firstly, one thing Jennifer didn't say about me is that I went to Highgate Wood School, which I know that lots of you did. So I'm really happy to see you all here today. On Nihir's point about lecture attendance, time management generally is a bit of an issue starting university because the structure of learning is so different to when you're doing your ASs and your A2s because it basically gets left up to you. You've got some hours a week where you're in lectures and then you've got this big expanse of time that you can either spend in the pub or in the library or whatever you're doing, and you kind of have to find ways to structure that time so that you can kind of keep motivated consistently every day or throughout the week or throughout the whole term, and you don't end up in a crisis with 5 essays due at the end of the term. Lots of things that really help with that, things that we probably didn't do as much as we should have, but wish we had, was kind of getting involved in activities on campus, like sports or clubs or societies. We'll talk a bit more about those in a bit, but just generally kind of making sure that there's other stuff going on in your life that's structured, that you can structure your work around, generally means it's a bit easier to transition from being, from having somebody watching over you to being in a situation where actually nobody checks up on you until you do your exams at the end, and you've kind of got to manage that. The second thing I wanted to say on the academic side is about your relationship with your supervisor or your director of studies. So this will probably be someone from your major department, or it may well be your dissertation supervisor. Whoever's going to be your kind of key academic contact within the department of the university you're in, it's really worth developing good relationships with those people by just kind of like common sense stuff like being straightforward, being on time to meetings, being well prepared. If you need an extension or you need some help with something non-academic, making sure you give them plenty of notice of that. And there are a lot of things that your supervisor can do for you if you maintain that good relationship. So when I finished my degree, my supervisor was writing me references, they were giving me advice on where to think about doing my master's, and they were also keeping an eye out for job opportunities related to my subject. And that was all because we had that good relationship in the first place. So that's why that's important. On the social side, Freshers Week. Freshers Week can be interesting. One of the things that can happen is that you can end up with a bit of a motley crew of people that you wouldn't necessarily hang around with normally. And there's kind of quite a lot of pressure to find to find your friends and find people that you're going to want to hang around with and who are going to be your close friends throughout the whole degree period. And often that takes a bit of time. And I remember thinking at the end of my first week, if these are the people I'm going to be hanging around with for 3 years, I'm not sure if this is definitely the right place for me, or so take advantage of that. Just enjoy meeting loads of people who are very, very different from you, coming with very different perspectives, and don't panic if you haven't found your people immediately, because often that does come a little bit later. Also on the social side, depending on where you are, whether you're at a campus university or if you're somewhere like UCL in the middle of the city, accommodation can be a real issue. Usually you'll be in halls in your first year, but you'll want to start thinking about where you're going to be living in your second year, probably sometime towards the end of your first term. So thinking about who you want to live with, and whether that's the people that you party with, or whether that's other people. And thinking about where in the city you want to live with, and doing your research around that, making sure you don't get messed around by landlords at the last minute. But that's really worth thinking about sort of towards the end of the first term. Yeah.
So then the next thing to do with the session, university life tends to be something that I hope you're all looking forward to. It's very different from what you've had already. There's a lot of hype around it that you're doing a subject that you should enjoy doing. You've got far more freedom, far more flexibility with your schedule. But at the same time, there's a tendency to view undergrad so degrees as this should be the time that I'm enjoying myself more than any other. Which probably might be the case, but equally there are times where things get very difficult. You've got exams, you've got other stresses. So that's worth keeping in mind, that is quite a natural part of doing a degree. And the nice thing about being at university is that there's a lot of different types of support available. So you've got student support, you've got your lecturers that you can talk to if it's to do more with academic side of stuff, or your director of the department. But equally there's union support as well, so you've got a student union there to help you out, to point in the right direction. So it's definitely worth taking advantage of that early rather than letting things kind of escalate. Career development, so the third, before we kind of answer any questions that you might have. So the other kind of, the obvious long-term point of university is also to guide you towards the career that you'd like to do after leaving university. And so there's, some of you may know very early or may already know what you'd like to do following your degrees, in which case that's great. Take advantage of the opportunities that the summer that you have to really gain exposure and really use that towards that career. But if a lot more of you, like myself when I did my degree, might not know what you want to do afterwards, again, it's worth really using university as a chance to kind of experiment with looking at different professions, looking into, there's lots of talks on offer, there's lots of societies that specialise in different areas, and it's definitely worth kind of taking advantage of that too. So don't worry too much if by the end of your third year you're still not sure what you want to do.
And on that note, internships. I didn't do any internships while I was doing my 5-year undergraduate degree, and I ended up doing a whole bunch of internships when I was 27, and I really wished I'd done them when I was 19 instead. So I would really recommend, especially if you're thinking about going into any kind of public policy job, or you're interested in working for an MP, something like that, using that time, using those summer holidays or a day a week during term to look at the kind of organisations that you're interested in working with after your degree, and seeing if you can do maybe work them part-time for a term, do a summer with them, maybe do even more than one by the time you finish your degree. It will put you in a really good position by the time you finish, especially as a lot of people coming out with political science degrees, the kind of things that they're interested in working in. Quite often, and especially in London, experience can be expected even at graduate level, so it's really worth getting that while you're doing a degree, and probably easier than doing it afterwards. There's one very good website which is called workformp.co.uk. If anyone's interested in starting to think about that kind of stuff, that's a really good place to start, because it's got a lot of different kinds of organisations there, and it'll just give you an idea of what's out there. Also on the career side, do use your university career services. They are brilliant. There are lots of vacancies that won't be advertised elsewhere, and they'll also be able to give you information on funding if you're thinking about going on to further study, or the kind of experience or skills that will be useful, that you'll need for the career that you want, or the kind of career that you could forge with the skills that you have. Those are the sort of the key things that came up when we canvassed some people who've recently finished their degrees, but I don't know if you guys have any questions about any aspects of undergraduate life.
Does UCL do a year abroad?
Does UCL do a year abroad?
Yeah.
It depends on the program you're doing. So So UCL, for example, I don't know if any of you are signed up to the ESPS, which is European Social and Political Studies. There's a year abroad for language, so you do a foreign language year. But a lot more courses are doing that, and I'm sure that's an option that would probably be available to you if you talk to your course director, actually, because that's really encouraged. And Erasmus as well is crucial.
And just on the Erasmus year abroad, that's actually something I meant to mention. That was probably the best year of my undergraduate degree. I very, very highly recommend it. You learn a lot, and you broaden your networks as well.
What degree did you do?
What degree did I do?
What did you do?
Swedish and art history. Like in here, I didn't quite work out what I wanted to do until a little bit later.
See, you obviously live in London and you want to go to university at London, but you don't want to stay at home. Can you stay in halls, or do you have to?
Yeah,
stay
you
in
can,
halls?
yeah. So you can apply, and so most people knew that.
Did you enjoy going to university in London, or if you had your time again, would you go outside?
That's a good question. So I don't really know. So I would say, because I did my undergrad at UCL, I did enjoy being in London, but equally it doesn't have quite the maybe as tight a university feel as if you're in a much smaller town. So I don't particularly like very small campus universities. So I visited friends who were at very small, and I find it slightly claustrophobic. So it kind of depends on. I mean, it's slightly more expensive in London, is the downside, but a lot more expensive in London. But I quite like being in London, and you can do other things outside of the campus, just being in the university.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are pros and cons. I, like Mihir, was from London and wanted and wasn't sure I wanted to do the degree in the city which I'd grown up in. So I went up to Edinburgh, which was about as far away as I could get. And I really enjoyed the experience of doing something different, but with the kind of things that I was interested in, probably slightly more opportunities in London. So it's a trade-off wherever you go. There are lots of pros and cons to being at home or going away and being in a city university or a campus university.
Yeah, building off your point about it being expensive to live in London, do you have to really go out of your way to raise the funds to live in London?
No, so I don't actually know the student loan situation, but in terms of student loans, if you're living, things